Sam Jaffe is an accomplished photographer, educator, and naturalist. And as founder of the Caterpillar Lab in Keene, New Hampshire, he married together his scientific curiosity with his love of the arts and made the world of caterpillars accessible to children as well as adults. Besides his scientific work, Sam does travel nationwide, teaching about what we can do to share our backyards and communities with our native insects. So that said, it's time to let Sam give us a close-up peek of caterpillars as seen through his eyes. So thank you, Sam.
Thanks so much. So I'm being a little daring today. I usually give these talks in the wintertime when there's not as many actual living resources around, meaning caterpillars. And there's a lot of slides and a lot of videos. But right now, it's sunny and hot outside. There's leaves on the trees. The caterpillars are out. And this building I'm in, this organization called the Caterpillar Lab, is just stuffed full of caterpillars. So I'm going to be doing a presentation that's really sort of broad with live microscope views of actual creatures that we have here, as well as slides and videos. So there'll be a lot of bouncing in between all of that stuff. But so just to be clear, this is a microscope camera setup right here. The screen is showing what's under the microscope. This is one of the ways that I'm going to share with you. And you can just see how this all works. We've got this tiny little box here with a single slug caterpillar in it that I'm putting under. More broadly, I'm sitting in the Caterpillar Lab. This is an organization I started about 10 years ago to share and celebrate all things caterpillar. And I'm going to just pick this up and show you around a little bit. So here we are in the Caterpillar Lab. It's a very busy time of year. We're doing school programs, all kinds of outreach events, different types of research, and presentations like this one. You can see my little table here of goodies to show you later. So it's a really fun place to be in. It can be a little bit overwhelming with all the life. Sometimes you can hear the sounds of caterpillars eating and pooping over the people in here, but that's just how I like it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Caterpillar Lab, and then we're going to jump into the world of caterpillars. The talk today is called The Whole Story, and it's really just a way of looking at caterpillars very broadly, at what makes them special, about all their ecological interactions, relationships with other organisms, and looking at them in a way that reveals how crucial they are to our ecosystems and how crucial biodiversity is in general to maintaining the world, the natural world that we want to enjoy. So we're gonna dare to share a screen here. See how it goes. One moment. All right, I'm hoping that that is a full screen view of the title of the talk here. If you're seeing my computer at all, someone can give me a little alert.
It's not quite full screen yet, Sam.
Not quite full screen. All right, so bear with me for a second while I try and get this right. Somehow this happened before. Apologies, guys. Okay. Share screen. Attempt number 2. Hopefully we're good now.
Beautiful.
Yes. All right, good. Technology mastered. Okay, so our talk again is the whole story, looking at caterpillars very broadly. But first, I just wanted to introduce you a little bit more to the Caterpillar Lab, since that's where I am today. It's an organization that's been around for about 10 years, and we look at caterpillars through every lens, and we help people explore them through every lens, whether it's through photography, film, and art, filming with the BBC, having caterpillars in movies, putting on art exhibits, running caterpillar drawing days, or through just these huge over-the-top outreach events where we have caterpillars on their native host plants with no barriers, so people can get up close and get to know these creatures. We just marvel at how many different ways people are drawn to these little characters. And really, I mean, the truth is the Caterpillar Lab had no initial plan. We just went out there with caterpillars and saw people's reactions. There was so much excitement, so much love for these, so many great questions that this organization developed around. So that's the support behind the presentation today. This is what we're about more than anything else. This little girl actually was totally taken by that Cecropia caterpillar there, one of our largest native species. Her mother was quite terrified of it. So it was a rather hilarious situation, but kudos to her mom for braving it. So through all these events, we would get asked the same question again and again, and that's sort of why caterpillars? Why focus on them? What makes them special? Why are they important to the world? Why should the visitor care about caterpillars? And I really liked exploring that question in my early talks. Most of my early talks were just called like, why caterpillars? And the answers started simply enough. They're cool, they're awesome, they're little characters, they're humorous, they're wonderful. And then they grew from there to include so much about the caterpillars' lives in the wild, the things that the caterpillars were doing, how they evolved, how they interacted with other organisms. And eventually, we landed on answers to that question of why caterpillars that had incredible depth and meaning, that equated to why biodiversity is important. Why should we care about anything in the natural world? So that initial question of why caterpillars really stimulated a lot of work. But before I get into ecological interactions and the importance of herbivory and pollination, which I've got to touch on today for sure, I really do want to go back to that initial answer and celebrate why caterpillars with the answer, because they really are just genuinely awesome. Caterpillars are great little creatures that are around us all the time. They're in our backyards, they're down the street, and they're not as simple as they seem at first. Some people just getting to know caterpillars might think of them as little green tubes, but there's so many different types of caterpillars living so many different types of lives. And just spending some time around them, we can say caterpillars are important because of all the other creatures they influence, but let's also say they're important because of just what they are inherent. So this is a slug caterpillar here. This is called the spiny oak slug caterpillar. It's a native to Eastern North America. And it's a little venomous caterpillar. The spines are made of silica, or pretty much glass, and they break when you touch them. I'm going to zoom way in. And they deliver a little sting. It's not really that painful at all, more like a stinging nettle. But this caterpillar is confident to be chewing away on this leaf because it has all of those spines. Also in this container, we've got a button slug caterpillar, rather dopey looking guy here. It's just a little dome on a leaf. Slug caterpillars are called slug caterpillars because they have no prolegs or legs along their abdomen. They just glide around on a sticky disc. It makes them very unique looking and maybe a little bit more like a deep sea creature living in your backyard than a normal caterpillar. This is one of the species we'll use at a program, one of our caterpillar lab events, just to get people over that initial hump of what a caterpillar can be. Really, a caterpillar is just anything that grows up to be a butterfly or a moth one day, and they take on all these forms. So I wanted a chance today just to share a huge volume of crazy caterpillars we have in the lab right now. I didn't want to keep those for you. So I thought I would use this caterpillars are awesome first step to do a bit of a show and tell. So I'm going to go through caterpillar after caterpillar. I'm probably not going to get to all the things I've got in front of me. And then we're going to move on to some of their broader importance. All right, let's see. Where do we go from slug caterpillar? Let's do another one that's just a little outside the box. I was out getting host plant or cherry for some caterpillars this morning. And on the cherry leaves, there were these little brown spots. These brown spots turned out to be case-bearing caterpillars. This is a very tiny little caterpillar that builds a shelter for itself out of silk and its own poop. So pretty industrious little thing. Caterpillars, again, they're all around us. They come in many forms. And a lot of what makes one caterpillar different from another caterpillar comes down to those broader interactions we're going to focus on later. But in this case, we can just look at this as a result of predation. This caterpillar is vulnerable. Lots of things want to eat it. It needed a defense to defend itself against predators. It's evolved this wonderful little case building behavior, whereas the slug caterpillar evolved those wonderful little venomous spines. Who else should we look at? Oop, come on, back in the box. Working with live animals is going to be a challenge. We'll see how this goes. Here is another wonderful species. I think I'm going to call them all wonderful today. This is a Dicorda emerald caterpillar, also native to Eastern North America. This one eats poison ivy and sumac. It especially loves the poison ivy, though. So for those of you who like the idea of planting native plants to attract native insects, even poison ivy might need a place if we're going to get these crazy things, the Dicorda emeralds. Our box a little bit. And we could talk about what this caterpillar eats some more or what eats it, but I do really, again, want to just urge us all to give them credit for being remarkable organisms. Maybe you want to attract this caterpillar to your yard to feed birds, but I would also want to attract this caterpillar to my yard for myself, just to inspire me or to inspire my kids or my neighbors. Change gears here. I've got some bigger caterpillars too. This is one of my absolute favorite species here that we get to work with. This twig here is covered with caterpillars. It's absolutely lined with them. These are the Artaceae or black dotted white bark mimicking caterpillars. And we'll try to get these under the microscope for you, but they're just remarkable dead bark mimics. Not dead bark mimics, just bark mimics. So here is the skin of our caterpillar. Let's just move along, try and find its front end. Oh, that's its rear end. All right. There we go. And I was going to show you how it blends right into the bark, but it's sitting right next to a second caterpillar. So we've got one caterpillar here and one caterpillar here. They've got hairs on their sides that they press down right against the cherry bark in this case, and it helps them blend right in and disappear from view. A lot of people ask about how they can go out and find their own caterpillars. And there's a lot of strategies for looking for caterpillars, but you have to admit they're pretty good at hiding. It takes a lot of time and attention. The very first time I found this species and others like it was just by getting host plant, and I put my hand on a branch and there it was squishy rather than hard, which was a little disconcerting, to tell you the truth. So that's bark mimicry. We also see a lot of twig mimicking species, and these are always one of the most rewarding displays we make for a program. We'll have a branch of oak, something like this in view, and quietly sitting on it will be a twig caterpillar. This one's moving around, unfortunately, a little bit. And people will be staring right at it, and they won't see a thing until either we point it out or we could blow on the caterpillar a little bit and it just moves slightly. And then they jump back and they laugh and they exclaim. And to see how people take humor in these creatures, to see how being fooled by them is something that engages us and brings people into wanting to know more about them. This is, again, the oak beauty caterpillar. It has these incredible green spots all over its body that just make it look a little bit more like an oak branch from far away. Now, all of the caterpillars we've looked at so far are native to Eastern North America. That's our sort of specialty area. We really want to talk about creatures that you can find right here at home. The oak beauty is something I've found many times in my backyard. This caterpillar is so unique that it's brought a lot of people from across the world to the caterpillar lab. In this box, we've got decorator emeralds. Decorator emeralds are little inchworms that cover themselves in petals. So you can see the body of the inchworm here, and it's covered with petals to camouflage themselves. So whatever flower they're born on, so moths going around laying eggs on different flowers, they'll pick the petals of that plant and they'll dress up. I'm going to try and get one moving around a little bit more for us. There we go. And the first 2 times we had film crews from the BBC come over to film, it was specifically to film these caterpillars putting petals on their back. And this is a very common species that you can find in your backyard, front yard, down the street, wherever. And they're often, the first generation of these is very much in time with a plant called daisy fleabane. So if you've got these little white daisy-like flowers, daisy fleabane around, when they're in full flower, start checking the tops of them. And some of those flowers will actually be caterpillars wearing the petals, walking around and eating. At some of our programs, we get to watch as these actually dress up and take on these new colors and shapes. Few more. All right, this one's sort of wild. So talk about caterpillars being just inherently interesting. These are called black etched prominent caterpillars. Now, this caterpillar looks like a leaf most of the time, but if it's discovered, it's going to rear up, gnash its jaws, inflate part of its head to make it look like it's got eye spots, inflate its anal prolegs, the last pair of prolegs, and wave them around its head with red tassels. We don't exactly know how this helps defend the caterpillar. I've been calling it the weird out defense, just because any bird that can still eat that caterpillar after seeing that dance deserves the meal. So this is our black edged prominent. There's the head going along. We've got those long extended legs into a tail. And now I'm just going to give him a little tickle and we'll see if we can make it dance. You gonna dance, buddy? Yeah. So here are the inflated tails that they wave across over their head. One more little bump to see what happens. So this is the black etched prominent here, one of many prominents that have various inflatable structures. All right, I'll end with this one before moving on to other discussions. I've been showing you caterpillars that are particularly exciting because of their different defenses, their forms, their color, their behavior. But caterpillars can be exciting for other reasons. This species we just found in a bog in southern New Hampshire, and it turns out after looking at its DNA, getting a little barcode done, this is a brand new undescribed species of Zestia dart moth that seems to only eat black spruce in bogs. So you can just go outside and you can see all of these marvelous species. You can attract them to your yard using different host plants. But you can also go outside and see something totally new that nobody's ever seen before. So this caterpillar comes in 2 colors. We're learning a lot about it. We're raising them and photographing them. And hopefully this will be a species that we can describe one day. It was right here about 40 minutes from the caterpillar lab in a bog. We're going to go back to share screen. All right. So I hope my little sort of show and tell helps convince you that caterpillars are inherently interesting, captivating, charismatic. Sometimes I call caterpillars charismatic and everyone laughs at me because they think it just doesn't fit. But then they meet something like this gaudy sphinx caterpillar that is a snake mimic that wags its tail when you touch it, and they start to get the point. Or they see a collection of weird little flannel caterpillars. This is, by the way, one of the most venomous caterpillars in the country, but looks more like I don't know, a little headless chicken, or she's a tribble, the trouble with tribbles for any of you Star Trek aficionados out there, but certainly not like what we imagine a caterpillar to be. These are all things that were videoed or photographed at the caterpillar lab here. We have a batch of flannel eggs hatching today or tomorrow, so we'll have these guys soon to show and tell their stories to the broader public. So with all of their colors and patterns, their weird defenses, I really think these are naturally captivating animals. When we have a program and we put out 80 species on displays, people gravitate towards them. It's really not that hard of a job to get people to come and start being excited about these creatures. It also helps that they're extremely diverse. These are all photographs taken at the lab of caterpillars we've had here. There's somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 species in New England alone that we get to work with. Generally, we work with around 500 or 600 species a year. So the opportunities are endless for sharing these creatures. But now I want to start paying attention to some of their broader stories. So there's still going to be a lot of amazing caterpillars to see, but we're going to look at them in a context that goes beyond the caterpillars themselves and looks at why caterpillars are important to consider outside of just being cool and awesome, as I like to start with. So let me get my little light box here. We've got a little thing to put together, and I'm going to get one of these little boxes with a leaf in it. Hopefully, I'm going to pick the right one here. One moment. These look great. Okay. So under the microscope now, I'm putting 2 sedge blades. Sedge is basically like a little grass-like plant. You can find it all over the place. And on the sedge, you can see these brown marks. So to a casual eye, this would just look like a sedge leaf that had gotten maybe frostbite or something like that. But more often than not, when you see a little brown mark on a leaf, there's a story behind it. It's not just a little frost mark. It's a story about a caterpillar or another insect coming by and grazing. In this case, though, we've got something a little bit more active to explore. Let's see. I'm going to zoom in right on this spot here. I wonder if you can't see something moving just under the surface there. So this sedge leaf has a leaf mining caterpillar in it. It's a caterpillar so small that it can fit between the top and bottom surface of a leaf, and it spends its whole caterpillar life inside that leaf, feeding really on just a single cell of plant at a time. So these are caterpillars in the tiniest spaces. And there's actually more caterpillars in these small spaces than there are out in the world. So there may be more caterpillar species in leaves and twigs and roots and stems than there are out on the leaves. Zoom in further on this one. So now we've got the light coming in from behind, and you can actually see the caterpillar through the leaf, and you can see the cell structure of the leaf as these little bricks, and it's taking just a bite here and there. Now, we started showing leaf miners at programs many years ago, and it was just an incredible technique for readjusting people's sense of scale. Caterpillars already seem small, like that was maybe the lower end of where the ecological world was functioning. But with leaf miners, we could show 3 different species of leaf miner in a single oak leaf. We could show them in all kinds of plants that people knew and interacted with. We would show them in these brown spots that everyone had seen for years and take it for granted. And then you just point out the window and you see the forest with all the different trees, and you get a sense for just how huge the ecological world really is from some of these tiniest things. But I also like this view because of what's actually happening here. And this caterpillar is eating this leaf on the smallest scale. It's eating one little green cell at a time in a sedge leaf. And what that really represents is huge, and it's taken for granted. It's even demonized, but it's incredibly important. This is herbivory. So this caterpillar is taking this material, consuming it, reorganizing it, and turning it into its own body, into caterpillar meat. Now, leaves are really hard to eat for most things. A sedge leaf is pretty impossible to eat. It's covered with silica. The energy in it isn't accessible to most animals, but this caterpillar is inside that leaf, and it's taking one cell at a time, and turning it into a much more user-friendly type of energy. So not a lot of things can eat leaves. Like we can't eat an oak leaf or a cherry leaf or a birch leaf and get energy from it, but caterpillars can, and they eat more leaves than pretty much everything else combined. So in New England terrestrial environments, caterpillars are consuming more green material than all other herbivores. That means more energy is moving from trees and plants into caterpillars than really is moving around terrestrial environments in other ways. So caterpillars are like superheroes. They're converting all this leaf into caterpillar, and we're going to look at that a little bit more closely. So here's just what we were talking about. Now, one of my goals here is to re-examine this interaction. We talk about ecological services like pollination and predation as these necessary, wonderful things that organisms are out there doing for us. But you never hear people celebrating the caterpillar eating the leaf as an ecological service. But all of those other services are based on this. We have plants that are bringing energy up, down from the sun, bringing nutrients up from the soil, making those leaves, and caterpillars unlock them. So this thing that you're watching right now, red maple flowers being devoured by a groat's pinion, is key to everything we care about in the natural world. So is this interaction. So this one's a little harder to take from those of us who have gardens or farmers growing tomatoes. But the tobacco hornworm, which is a native, wonderful caterpillar, one of our largest, consuming a tomato plant in the natural world is just energy moving to where it needs to get to. So tomato leaves are really poisonous things. They're hard to eat. Hornworms can eat them, they convert them to caterpillar bodies, and that energy can then move off to the rest of the world. So for all of that to actually work, let me stop sharing again. So for herbivory to be a positive and not the negative that many people assume it is, the energy can't stop with the caterpillars. And it's lucky then, I guess, not for the caterpillars, but for the rest of us, that caterpillars are also eaten in a tremendous variety of ways. So we're going to look a little bit about, how caterpillars are consumed now. So caterpillars eating more leaves than anything else and being eaten more often than anything else. Some of you might have heard about how many caterpillars are consumed by birds. So Doug Tallamy has done some research looking at how many caterpillars a chickadee needs to feed its young to have a successful batch. And we're talking in the thousands. So this is a lot of caterpillars per chick just to get them into the air. So birds totally depend on caterpillars, but that's really the tip of the iceberg. In fact, birds don't eat that many caterpillars compared to other things. The number one predators or consumers, I should say, of caterpillars are the parasitoid wasps and flies, and they're just endless. So this little caterpillar in its leaf, when we're doing programs later in the year, we'll get leaf miners like this. And at some point during the program, the leaf miner will stop moving and more or less die. And we'll examine it a little bit more closely, and something will start to move on its side and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And we can watch as a parasitic wasp consumes a caterpillar inside of a leaf. So all of this eating is matched with things eating the caterpillars. Even in these leaf miners, we have parasitic wasps consuming. Turn this off. I have a few neat current examples of parasitism. We were just out at a blueberry barrens, and in the low bush blueberry, we found these strange little white things. We were using an ultraviolet flashlight. They would light up bright white or purpley white under that light. We could really spot them from anywhere. These are mummified caterpillar remains. This is a caterpillar called the Triton dagger. It's a dagger moth species that only eats blueberries. And all of these Triton daggers we were finding last fall had been parasitized by an Aloides mummy-making wasp. And this wasp lays an egg into the caterpillar. Its young grows up inside of the caterpillar. And then right as the caterpillar is getting towards its sort of middle stages here, the wasp's ready to mature, and it consumes the entire inside of the caterpillar and then makes a cocoon out of its body. So you can see the old caterpillar's head here. Its body is now arched in this cocoon, and right in the middle of this will be our Aloides wasp. This wasp only eats the Triton dagger. Now, there are generalist wasp and fly parasitoids, which go around and lay eggs in lots of different butterfly and moth larvae, caterpillars. But there are also many, many specialists, and this is one of the many specialists. So we had the Triton dagger eating the blueberry leaf, and now we have this little wasp eating the Triton dagger. And we actually had one emerge today. Oh, well, that was nice. So here's the old mummified caterpillar here. Now it has an exit hole towards the back, and the wasp, this unique little Aloides, is over here giving itself a little clean. Now, we call ourselves the Caterpillar Lab here. I'm always excited to have healthy, happy caterpillars, but when we are getting caterpillars from outside, some years over 50% of the time we get wasps and flies. So it's more often wasps and flies that are the outcome of rearing these creatures than butterflies and moths. And that's really as it should be. That's a very natural situation for these. And I could probably show you parasitoids all day. I'm going to spare you that, but I'll just show you one more here. We had an inchworm called a scopula inchworm that we were raising. We don't know the species. It could be a totally new life history. And one of them shed its skin and became this pupa. So a pupa is the middle life stage between caterpillar and adult moth. It looks like an adult moth. You've got like a wing bud here, an antenna, legs down the middle. It's actually alive. This is the living thing, not just a case with a caterpillar inside. But this is the stage where a lot of reorganizing happens and you end up with that adult moth body that sheds the pupa skin away. The other of two of these scopula caterpillars wasn't as lucky as this one and ended up like this. And this is the result of being used by a polyembryonic wasp larva. So the caterpillar earlier on had a tiny little black wasp land on it. She laid one egg into its body. As the caterpillar grew, that egg split and cloned itself into many, many eggs, and the resulting eggs hatched and the larva consumed the caterpillar, and they're now pupating within it. So some of these stories are pretty gory, but they're really, really important. We need the caterpillars eating leaves. We've got to unlock that energy, but we need caterpillars being eaten as well. And birds are a great start to that. Caterpillars are really important to birds, but the major checks and balances on caterpillar population are going to be the wasps and flies and other insects that consume them in these very specialized ways. Okay. Let me go back to my screen share here. So I just wanted to look at this a little bit more. This is titled Caterpillars in the Middle. And the idea, again, is that caterpillars have these close relationships with plants. They're great consumers, and they have these close relationships with the things that eat them. They're very good at being consumed. The tobacco hornworm that you might see in your gardens is often used by a braconid wasp. That's the wasp to the left, the black wasp there. She lays eggs into the hornworm. The larvae emerge, and they build cocoons on its back. That wasp is in turn consumed by a hyperparasitoid chalcid wasp. That's the little green wasp in the bottom right there. So in this case, we have a wasp, eating a caterpillar, eating a tomato in your backyard. And this is common. This is not exceptional. We can show this at our programs again and again and again. We just go out and we grab some hornworms and we can get all these interactions. We've had 4 species of hyperparasitoid wasp come out of a hornworm from my own backyard. Here's another crazy example. I collected an egg of a tobacco hornworm. That egg, instead of developing into a caterpillar, had 2 species of egg parasitoid wasps within it. We've got these 2 little orange ones and 1 big black wasp, all that developed inside the egg of a hornworm. So even at the stage of a freshly laid egg, these things are at risk of parasitism and predation. And again, if these are all native creatures interacting, this is the way it should be. This was really remarkable. This was at a program, and we watched this whole scenario happen with other people, and we've still never heard of this again. Multiple species, not just multiple individuals, but multiple species of egg parasitoid wasp inside of a hornworm egg. This parasitism, caterpillars in the middle, this whole idea, this is also sort of how I got my start. I've always been doing stuff with caterpillars. Since I was 4 years old or so, I was bringing caterpillars into my parents' house. And one of my earliest memories was raising black swallowtail caterpillars with my parents and being told that we were going to get these beautiful butterflies. The caterpillars formed their chrysalis or pupa. And the pupa would actually come out different colors depending on what substrates they pupated on. So was it a rough twig or a smooth twig, a green crayon or a red crayon? The pupa would come out these different colors. And I was told that we were going to get these gorgeous butterflies, and I went down every morning to look at them. And instead of a butterfly coming out, I got to watch as a, oops, there we go. A trogus wasp emerged from the pupa. So this is a specialist parasitoid on black swallowtails. Now, nowadays, when I'm telling this story, I get some horrified looks in an audience, people who think this was devastating to me. But as a little kid, this was just a surprise. This was exciting and new. It was something my parents didn't know about that I could learn. So I really benefited from examining these incredible relationships even back then. And I thought I would end this little section of consumption of caterpillars in the middle with a bit of an unexpected twist here. Even sometimes caterpillars are the consumers of caterpillars. So this is a lithophony pinion caterpillar on the left, eating a Phagolia caterpillar on the right. And now we've got some nice music to lighten the mood. So this really is the life of a caterpillar, eating and being eaten, right there in the middle of our ecosystems. Okay. For this talk especially, I wanted to acknowledge an entirely, different ecological service here. We've got herbivory, we've got predation, but we also have pollination. Caterpillars are the larvae of butterflies and moths, and many butterflies and moths are pollinators. Quite a lot are out there after dark visiting flowers, doing that important service. But there are some examples that are a little bit more specialized, and I wanted to look at those. So we're very lucky to have a pretty unusual caterpillar, pretty rare in the East right now, and it's called Shinia guare. Shinia is a genus of flower caterpillars. So they feed mostly on the flowers and fruits of plants. This one feeds on the flowers of guara. I'm feeding it currently evening primrose, which is in the same family. There's another one over here. The flower caterpillars are very specialized. They usually only use a single type of flower or plant. And the moths often rest in that plant during the day. So these caterpillars are out there consuming guara. Meanwhile, as adults, they're sitting in those flowers, moving from flower to flower and pollinating the same plants they were eating as a caterpillar. So we don't know with Shinia if the net result is a benefit to the plant or a cost. The caterpillars are eating them and the adults are pollinating them, but it shows that link. It shows how caterpillars, even in one species, can interact in multiple ways with a plant. Share screen again, because I got to photograph the full life history of this species. So I was down south working on taking images for a book that's going to be coming out in the next few years, and found all these caterpillars, but also on the guara flowers were the adult moths. And they look like the flowers. They just make it look like there's an extra bloom. They're sitting there nectaring on them, and their whole camouflage is based on being on those flowers. If you're in the Northeast like us, one that you can look for is another flower moth, Shinia florida, which eats the common evening primrose. It's a pink and yellow moth, and it sits in the yellow flowers of the evening primrose during the day. I also wanted to just celebrate sphinx moths again. So we looked at the tobacco hornworm. This is an image of a giant sphinx, and with its tongue partly pulled out so you can see. And the tobacco hornworm also has an incredibly long tongue and is an important pollinator. So that tobacco hornworm that eats your tomato plants as an adult is a very unique pollinator in the Northeast. It has actually the longest tongue of any pollinator in this region. This is really one of my favorite pollination stories because instead of being that straightforward butterfly or moth visits flower, we have a pollinator here that depends on a whole chain of interactions to exist. So below, we've got a caterpillar called the waved sphinx. The waved sphinx is a specialist on ash trees. It only eats ash. We find it pretty commonly here. We're a little worried about it because emerald ash borer, an invasive species, is in the area and killing off all the ash trees. So only host for the caterpillar is ash, and the caterpillar is the only host for this incredible parasitoid fly, tachinid fly that you see pictured above the caterpillar. It's called Belvosia borealis. Belvosia borealis, again, only uses Ceratomia sphinx, waved sphinx on ash. So to get this fly, you need to have the caterpillar on its host. And once you have the fly is a devoted pollinator to umbelliferous plants. So this is a fly that you find very, very commonly on cow parsnips in the area. So in this case, it wasn't just caterpillar grows up to be a pollinator or a bee is a pollinator. It's you need the tree, the habitat, the tree, the caterpillar, the fly, and that's how you get your pollinator. And that really fits into a really large story I want to highlight here, which has to do with a cascade of interrelated, relationships, all of which are dependent on each other to give the result of a few creatures that we value being around. So we just had that pollinator needing all of those things. Now we're going to look at a story that starts with an ant. So let me get my little ants here under the screen. Went out yesterday and I found this year's first acorn ants. These things are wonderful. You can go out in the woods this time of year. You look for last year's acorns, one that's complete, so not halved like this, but has a little hole in it. And if you open that up, you'll have an entire colony of ants. These are like little pocket ants. I can move them around to programs. They're easy to feed and take care of. And when we're ready to let them go again, we just put them back out in the woods near a complete acorn. So we're going to relate these ants to some caterpillars, I promise. But to get these ants, we needed a lot of things to happen, right? We needed an acorn to germinate and grow over many, many years into an oak tree. We needed that oak tree to be successful enough to start producing acorns. And we needed those acorns to fall and not be consumed by a squirrel or picked up by me. Once those acorns were there, this creature called an acorn weevil can find them. It drills a little hole into the acorn, lays an egg, and its larva consumes the inside of the acorn, hollowing it out. So the acorn weevil is converting all of these acorns into basically these perfect little ant condos. It's hollowing them out and leaving a little hole. So once the weevil is gone, the ants can move in. We have 3 species of devoted acorn ant right here in southern New Hampshire. There are species of these all over the country, and just a remarkable little story. Now, oak tree, acorn, weevil, ants. Once you've got ants in an area, the entire forest starts to change. Ants do a lot of things for the environment. They move resources around, they predate, they really change the nature of the forest floor. They also allow some creatures to exist that couldn't previously have existed in the area. One of those creatures might be somewhat familiar to you. It's an aphid. So garden aphids often don't look quite like these things. You'll see little aphids on roses, things like that, that are green, and you can see their legs and everything. Those are often tended by ants. They feed ants sugar water. The ants drink the sugar water and protect the aphids from predators. And that's what's going on here too. These are called woolly alder aphids. These aphids only live on alder trees and alder swamps. They're sucking the juices out of the plant right now. Let's see if I can get a better view of some of these. They're tapped into the plant, they're sucking the sugars out. They release the sugars. If there's ants in the areas, the ant comes and feeds on those sugars and protects the aphids. Colonies of these aphids cannot persist without the ants there. So to get these aphids, we needed this long list of ingredients to come together, right? We needed the oak tree and the acorn weevil and the acorn ants. We needed an alder tree and an alder swamp that was maybe a little stressed on the edge of its environment and ended up with these aphids on it. And for the aphids to persist, we needed those ants from the oak tree to find them. So long list of ingredients. And finally, at the very end of the list, we can get a wonderful native butterfly. And right now, this time of year, what I've got of them is their pupa. So this is the pupa of the harvester butterfly. It's a carnivorous butterfly. The caterpillar of this butterfly feeds only on the woolly alder aphids. That's their one host. They don't eat the tree, they eat the aphids. So to get a butterfly, the harvester butterfly, we needed all of those ingredients to come together. I've got some images of that should be a little bit more exciting than the pupa here, although it is a really interesting little bird dropping mimic pupa. So here is our harvester caterpillar staring down an aphid that's actually, you can see its legs as it's moving around. At programs later in the year, we'll have the harvesters sort of sliding around, picking up aphids and consuming them. They do it very casually, just like watching a caterpillar eat a leaf, but it's an aphid there. And this is the adult butterfly. So this adult butterfly was thought to be pretty rare for a time. It may be in some areas, but it was thought to be rare because no one was seeing it on their garden flowers. These butterflies really associate so closely with those aphids that if the aphids aren't right there, you don't see the butterflies. And the butterflies even nectar on the same sugar the aphids are making to feed the ants to protect them. It gets a little complicated after a while. There's also another type of interaction between involving ants and caterpillars, and a more direct one. So with the harvester butterfly, we had a species that ate a food that needed ants to be around. In this case, we've got a caterpillar that uses ants for its defense. A lot of the hairstreak and blue butterflies sing to ants to attract them, feed ants a little bit of sugar water, and end up getting the ants' protection. It's similar to the aphids, except it's being shown that in many cases, the caterpillar does a little bit of extra manipulation so that it doesn't have to keep feeding the ant sugar water, which is expensive. They actually have a secret chemical in their sugar water that seems to take the dopamine out of ant brains, makes the ants depressed. And then once the ants are depressed, they're easier to manipulate. The ants will defend these caterpillars to the death from even large predators like me, all just to be around them. There's these little weird tentacles that pop out right there called tentacular organs that may have something to do with this as well. Okay. So we just got a little weird there, I hope. We looked at a whole bunch of different types of interactions, and I hope it's coming across that caterpillars really are in the middle of it all, that herbivory and predation and pollination and mutualisms, all these relationships surround them, and they're incredibly important relationships. So I wanted to now look at some common caterpillars, things that we might already know, but take for granted in this new light of the whole story idea, this idea that a caterpillar isn't an isolated thing, but it's part of this vast network. So we're going to start by looking at the tent caterpillars. So these are one of my absolute favorite spring caterpillars. They will be familiar to many, many people in this area in the eastern United States and beyond. They're the most social caterpillar on the planet. They live in this communal nest. These are all brothers and sisters living together. They build this nest out of silk. They all come out and they have these active periods where they build it together. When they go out to forage, they go out along these branches and they find new leaves. And when they come back from those new leaves, they leave a trail of silk that tells their brothers and sisters that they found good food, and all the other caterpillars will go out and feed. So they're communicating with each other through silk. They're living together. They're just phenomenal. And there's so much to say about these. I could do a 2-hour-long talk on just tent caterpillars, but we'll do a little bit more focused work here. So here under the microscope, we've got one of them, the eastern tent caterpillar. This is a specialist on cherries, and it eats a lot of cherries. Some years we can have a lot of tent caterpillars around, and nearly every young cherry in the area gets at least partially defoliated. These trees will leaf out again later, but it's pretty dramatic. I mean, you can see roadsides that have been just dominated, just decimated by their feeding. But thinking in terms of the whole story, that may not be a bad thing. This is a native caterpillar. It's got a really unique place in the environment. It's being used by hundreds of species of parasitic insects, not dozens, but hundreds of species of wasps and flies have been documented coming out of eastern tent caterpillars. It's also eaten by a range of birds, including one that's a real specialist on this caterpillar, the yellow-billed cuckoo. These caterpillars are not easy to eat. They're covered with irritating hairs, and their bodies are full of hydrogen cyanide, which they make from their cherry family host plants. Cuckoos seem to be immune to hydrogen cyanide, and they regurgitate their stomach lining whenever it gets coated with these hairs. Cuckoos migrate in time to come up and start their families right when these tent caterpillars are at their maximum. They open up tent caterpillar nests, and they can eat tons of these and grow their young on them. Other birds have to be a little bit more restricted. You'll see orioles and blue jays and others coming in and grabbing 1 or 2 tent caterpillars at a time, but they can't just go wholesale on. So tent caterpillar is a native insect that defoliates. It's being used by lots of creatures. So for all it's taking, it's giving back. And it's unlikely to defoliate forests year after year after year because of all the checks and balances that are here in our environment. So if you see this tent here across the road from your house in the woods, this is a good thing. This is the environment functioning as it should. It's native creatures being used by other native creatures. It's energy flowing around the world. If you have this in your favorite young cherry tree you just planted, I might say it's still a really great thing, but I'll acknowledge they do eat that cherry tree. So in that case, you might want to protect your cherry tree, but don't mistake wanting to protect something like a cherry tree or your tomato plants from a native caterpillar as something that you're doing for the natural world. You're doing that because you are raising the cherry tree or your tomato plant above the surrounding world, which is okay if you want to maintain a vibrant garden. But tent caterpillars definitely shouldn't be demonized here. So let's go back to our screen again. All right, so there's some of that defoliation. The eastern tent caterpillar eats cherries. They do it very well. This is a time lapse we did just over the course of one night. These caterpillars came out, they found food. Some of them put silk trails back to the nest that said the food was there, and you can watch as it totally disappears. So they're all going down along quite a circuitous route to get up to their food, but they can do that because of the communication between individuals. I didn't really believe they were going to finish this in one night, but they had no trouble doing that. There's also the forest tent caterpillar, which is similar but doesn't build these nests. They just live in these big masses and they travel around together. These can defoliate larger patches of forest because they eat a broader range of plants. They are known to defoliate sugar maples and sugar bushes in New England. So plots of maple that people are getting maple syrup from. Now, though they can defoliate those, they'll only do that once out of every 10 or 20 years, and those defoliations can end up acting like a low-grade wildfire. They can kill off older, less productive trees. They can kill off understory trees that never had a chance. They can freshen up our forests. So defoliation is not necessarily a bad thing when we're talking about native species, even though it can be hard to watch. Now, there's another creature that we can compare these two to that sort of has a different outcome here. And that's because it's not actually a native local organism that has a whole story here in New England. It's an introduced invasive species that had a whole story, all these connections in Europe and Asia, but doesn't have it here. So this is the spongy moth. It previously went by another name, but it's been renamed the spongy moth. It's the caterpillar that's been defoliating New England forests for years. It was introduced around 100 years ago. It did not have natural predators. It did not have parasitoids. It didn't have pathogens to kill it off. So when it defoliated, it would defoliate year after year after year, leading to some serious problems in forest decline. It's not a caterpillar that I really want to demonize. I grew up actually raising these. I had these as pets. I learned from them. I was fascinated by them. But I do want people to know that this is a creature that's not supposed to be here and doesn't add back to the environment. The environment would be better off without this particular caterpillar. Let me go back to our view because I've got some of these creatures here. So this is the spongy moth. This is a middle instar. So whereas the tent caterpillar ate and gave back, this just eats and eats and eats. And to try to control this creature that was disrupting our ecosystems, people started adding other creatures to our ecosystems. It's called biocontrol. So a parasitic fly called Compsoglyra was introduced that uses it as a host. Parasitic wasps, egg parasitoids, were introduced that use their eggs. Pathogens, fungal pathogens, and bacterial pathogens were introduced to control these. The result is that the spongy moth and many other invasive species that we've dealt with aren't as big of an issue as they used to be. They defoliate some years and then their population drops as their checks and balances that were introduced balance off. But our manipulation of this system wasn't perfect. And for all of the good it does to try and control this species, there have been some trade-offs. I'm going to show you some of those trade-offs right now. One of them comes with, I think, one of the most spectacular caterpillars to look at under the microscope. This is a relative of the spongy moth. This is Daisy Kyra here. This is a tussock moth, and it looks like a bunch of fireworks when you zoom in. It's got 7 different kinds of defensive setae or hairs. It's got venom glands that pop in and out. They wipe their hairs over those venom glands. It makes them an itchy caterpillar. They really are quite striking and beautiful. Oops, sorry there. Temporary malfunction, hopefully. They're really incredible looking caterpillars with all these hairs. Perfect. Okay, thank God. And we had about 6 species that were recorded in New England. 6 of these, 6 different types of these Daisy Kyra tussocks. And in recent years, only 2 have been recorded with any regular predictability. So this tussock here has not been seen in our area very often at all. And one that was incredibly common when I was growing up, Daisy Kyra versiflava, or the yellow-based tussock, seems to be all but gone now. So this is actually the first time I've seen this caterpillar, or had this caterpillar around in a decade. These are both related to the spongy moth, the caterpillar that was introduced, that was invasive, and that we introduced all these things to kill it off. And one theory as to why Daisy Kyra have become less common, may have even been extirpated in some cases from New England, is because of those things we put in place to kill the spongy moth. So there's all these positives and negatives when we start messing with the environment. It's really beautiful caterpillar. This one's pre-shed, so it looks a little funny right now, but you can still see the details of all of its beautiful setae. Another caterpillar which seems to have declined because of some of the things we put in place for the spongy moth is the largest caterpillar in New England, which becomes the largest flying insect in North America, and that's the Cecropia. This is one of the giant silk moths. This caterpillar gets the size of a breakfast sausage. It's relatively hardy when it comes to pesticides. So this caterpillar is still sometimes found in urban areas. I found some along the Charles River near Boston growing up. But the tachinid fly, Compsognathus, that was released to kill off the spongy moth also goes after this caterpillar and many others. And this species has declined in the area, and we think that's because of Compsognathus. So we've looked at this biodiversity of relationships so far in this talk. We've seen caterpillars, awesome caterpillars, as important because they eat and they're eaten, and through all of their interactions. That diversity is an incredible strength. It really maintains the environment. It supports it. It makes it predictable year to year. We know every year there's going to be enough caterpillars, enough trees for the caterpillars and enough caterpillars for the birds. And that's because of all of these checks and balances. That's because of the diversity. But it's also a vulnerability in some ways, especially when you introduce people and rapid change. When we introduce a non-native caterpillar that eats too much, when we introduce a biocontrol that goes after some of our native species, when we get rid of a habitat or a host plant, or when we have climate change coming in and totally changing these environments much faster than they would naturally, all of these changes disrupt these relationships, disrupt that biodiversity of relationships. And when one of those relationships goes down, it can have a cascading effect. Think of the harvester butterfly and all of those relationships it took to get to that butterfly existing. You remove the ant or the oak tree or the aphid or the acorn weevil, and that collapses. So that's something we really have to look out for, because I want to have Cecropia caterpillars long into the future. Second. So I feel sometimes at this point like I've come to the end of a nature show, and I'm giving these things were all cool, but they're all in trouble. And they are all in trouble. Insect decline is real. Caterpillars every year, I feel like I'm seeing fewer. Every year at my moth lights where I attract moths to get eggs to raise caterpillars, I feel like I've got fewer moths. You can talk to people going back generations who can just track that decline in the diversity of these creatures and the numbers of these creatures. So that's pretty depressing. But there are things that we can do, actions that we can take as individuals or as a group that I think can start to help these creatures come back and find a home around us. For me, education and awareness really come first. The fact is, most people don't know about these incredible creatures. They don't know the diversity, the range of behaviors. They don't know how exciting they are. And if you don't know about something, and if you don't love something, it's really hard to imagine people going out there and wanting to protect it. So I sing from the rooftops. I want everyone to know about caterpillars. I want everyone to know how special they are. I want other people who care about other organisms to be out there being some form of naturalist extrovert, to just get out there and tell people about these creatures. Because if we don't know about them, we're not going to be able to protect them. I also think that we can do a lot with our own spaces or through community action, political action to benefit biodiversity. There's a lot of discussion about creating pollinator habitats. There's discussions about putting in some native host plants to your garden. These are wonderful starts, but we do want to think on a biodiverse sort of whole habitat scale. So in your pollinator garden, you should also have some loose leaves from last year, some coarse woody material, some uncompacted earth that things can burrow down into and spend the winter, some grasses and sedges in the in-between spaces. The more that our places look like natural places, the more life we're supporting. I really promote the idea of just letting some areas of our properties grow, promoting the native plants and getting rid of invasive and non-native plants. But a manicured garden with native plants doesn't have all the ingredients to support all of the things that I just showed you. So focusing on biodiversity as our goal, I think, is really important. This is sort of reiterating, but our space is our chance to help. You can change your own yards, your own gardens. You can also reach out into your community. Roadsides and power line cuts are incredibly important areas for wildlife. You can talk to people who manage those. I have an airport nearby. It's got a lot of floodplain space. We get a lot of our host plants for the caterpillars there. And a simple conversation with the airport manager changed the way that they mow their meadows and made a big difference for the amount of butterflies and moths that we saw using those areas. So reaching out into the community can help as well. So I hope after this talk, you have a reason to want to go out and protect these creatures and feel like there are some things we can do. But again, education first. Everyone has to know these are there, they're important, and they're worthy of our attention. All right, so that's my talk for today. I'm going to end by just sharing a screen that's got my information on it, and then I'm happy to take questions and anything else that comes my way. So thank you so much.
Wow, Sam, that was just absolutely incredible. And we are so appreciative of you taking the time. The feedback in the chat has just been amazing. And I know that was really, really eye-opening for me as well. We're going to move into some Q&A.
Sure.
Let's see here. See if we can get Donna back on.
Meanwhile, I'm going to make sure all my caterpillars are actually housed so they don't run away.
Oh, there we go. I was having trouble unmuting myself. Sorry, Jamie.
No worries.
So we do have a bunch of questions here, and I'm going to start from the top, Sam. They might be from the beginning of your talk, but
Sure.
The first question here is, what does the slug caterpillar that you talked about in the beginning turn into?
So slug caterpillars are a family of moths, the limacodids. We have something like 14 species in New England alone, dozens and dozens of species throughout North America. The moths they turn into are pretty adorable little things. They're just fluffy moths with rounded wings. They don't have venomous spines or anything like that. They look more like a normal moth, certainly than their caterpillars look like a caterpillar. And they're mostly active this far north in the fall. These ones are from a little further south, so I could show them to you today. But slug caterpillars are really fun to look for. You can go out in August and September, especially on slug hunts. You look on smooth leaf plants like cherry, oak, and some birches, especially leaves that are low down on the tree. And you just turn them over and you might have this thing that looks like a sea creature sitting there for you. So again, like when you look at the moth, you'd hardly know they came from these creatures, but yeah, they're one of our favorites, clearly.
Oh, wow. This next question, seems like it's two parts.
Mhm.
How do we prevent destructive caterpillars while welcoming the good things they do for our environment? And how do we prioritize for providing for natives and not invasives? For example, this person experienced highly prevalent caterpillars who every year attack tree leaves on Kiowa Island, South Carolina, where they lived before moving to Massachusetts. They were very destructive, and their silken webs threatened the trees.
Mhm.
So
So
good
it's
and bad.
a huge question, and I could sort of do a whole nother talk just on this subject. And I'm going to attempt to just sort of hit a few key points. And I know it won't answer that question completely. So if the person asking that would like to email me or have a discussion, we can try to get into it more. But from that, I'll just say there's a big difference between native and non-native organisms. So knowing the caterpillars is the thing that's eating the trees, something that's been there for thousands of years doing that, and that will be eaten by all these other creatures that we care about? Or is it an invasive species? So in New England, we have the spongy moth, the brown tail moth, and the winter moth as our major invasives that sort of defoliate forests and really cause damage. Unfortunately, sometimes these invasive species make our native species do more damage. So if we had defoliations from the spongy moth for 5 years in a row, and then we had an outbreak of the native good guy, forest tent caterpillar, those trees are already stressed. So the equation of what's good or bad for the forest changes, all based on the things that we've disrupted and changed. So again, usually we're promoting the native species as generally good for the environment and saying the non-native species don't belong here and we'd be better off without them. I also like people to think about the context when they're defining a good guy and a bad guy or a pest and a beneficial. The context is really important. So any native creature that's eating your favorite flower in the world that you're growing to bring to the flower contest, to be judged, is not doing you a favor. It's still eating that plant. It's not good for the plant. It's not going to win you the blue ribbon. But that's not the natural world we're talking about. So if you are removing tobacco hornworms because they're eating your tomatoes, or if you are taking a tent caterpillar mass like this one out of your tree or opening it up so the birds can get it, I just really want people to consider, like, okay, in my yard at this moment, I'm making this decision for me, which is okay a lot of the time. But in the woods across the way, even if it looks horrendous, even if all the trees are being eaten by forest tent caterpillars or eastern tent caterpillars, on the whole, there's a balance there. These things are giving back. And too often we forget that. We only talk about good guys and bad guys in the context of our gardens, and we transfer that to the ecological world. And that's why herbivory is demonized, right? They eat our vegetables. That's bad. Even though if caterpillars weren't eating leaves in New England, everything would fall apart. So I'm not going to give any direct suggestions there, but hopefully that's a start.
Wow, so captivating. Oaks are struggling now with wilt or blight. What can we plant instead of an oak that will still be beneficial?
So oaks come up a lot. Doug Tallamy's really championed oaks as one of the most central host plants. So many things eat oaks. I'm going to step in and just urge diversity again. So oaks can be right there side by side with a long list of other really important host plants. So when we're getting host plants for our caterpillars at the lab, there are these key species we're always getting, and that includes cherries, poplars and willows, birch, oak, and what else do I have over there? Blueberry. There are all these plants that just have long lists of caterpillars that use them. And any one of those things in complete isolation isn't going to support that many caterpillars either. So plant an oak tree, that's fantastic. Get some poplars going, get some blueberries, make sure that the ground is soft in places and has leaf litter so that everything can thrive there. But as a direct replacement for oaks, hopefully some of the many oak species are going to be resistant to a blight. If beech is working, beech does host a lot of the species that use oak. But, for a caterpillar person, these various blights and diseases and invasives that are killing off our trees are pretty gut-wrenching. I mean, when we lose ash trees in New England, there goes all the caterpillars that eat them and all the things that eat those caterpillars. And if we lose oaks, that's a very, very long list that we're losing. As far as what to plant to promote a lot of things using your yard or supporting caterpillars that need support in your area, you do want to think about your broader neighborhood. So if I was in where I grew up, right outside of Boston, the roadsides are all managed. There's just no hedges of native plants. There's no poplar, no willow, no birch, no oak, no cherry. And putting any of those in my yard and letting that be a little hedge of plants would support an incredible amount of things. Here in New Hampshire, we've got endless woods full of those plants. And actually, what New Hampshire really needs is a little less forest. So maintaining open habitat, having a more prairie-like area or floodplain, that would support creatures that are struggling in New Hampshire. So it really does depend on what your neighborhoods look like, what you should plant to help support the most creatures.
Wow. What is the native area and host plant for flannel caterpillars?
Flannels eat a lot of different plants, usually hardwood trees. But pretty much any and all of them. I almost included some baby hatchling flannels today. I have some, but they're across the lab. So they eat a lot of different plants. They show up in a lot of different places, and they are quite venomous. So if you see one of these cute little fluffy guys, enjoy them, but don't touch them. I'd say probably oaks are among their favorites, but that's hardly what they're limited to. As far as just venomous caterpillars, since that came up with the flannels and others we were looking at, if you see a hairy or spiny caterpillar, it's reasonable to assume that it might be one that can cause a sting or a rash, something like that. A lot of those depend on the individual who's touching the caterpillar. So people can have allergies to certain caterpillars. I can touch almost any hairy caterpillar and not get a rash. There are other people who are obsessed with caterpillars who can't even, get within feet of some of these things. But avoiding them, it's a lesson in personal responsibility. These aren't flying after you. They're not aggressive. You just have to know not to touch certain caterpillars and know when to be aware of what could be on the plants around you while you're hiking, and you can protect yourself just fine.
How can we tell non-native caterpillars from native caterpillars?
Really the thing to do is to learn the non-natives. There are
Mhm.
tons and tons of native caterpillars, but in a day you could do a little review of almost all of the impactful non-natives. I'm gonna just say them again for a quick list: that the spongy moth, which used to go by a different name, the spongy moth, the brown-tail moth, and the winter moth are the most impactful species, non-native species in New England. But be careful, because if you Google some of these, you're going to get pictures of native caterpillars. There's a lot of misconceptions out there. For instance, the eastern tent caterpillar is regularly assumed to be a non-native species just because it can be so common.
For caterpillars that only host, whose only hosts are ash, will it utilize water ash?
So we actually did a study on ash feeding caterpillars, looking at whether they would use non-native ash family plants. So we grew things like that waved sphinx on ash, on lilac, which is in the ash family, privet, which is in the ash family, and forsythia. And they survived moderately well on some of those hosts, but we had some really surprising and negative results with privet. These caterpillars that were grown on privet, and we've seen them feeding on privet in the wild, had very deformed pupa, and the adults weren't viable. So they were eating privet and actually dying from that experience. A lot of them will eat other ash family plants. I don't know if water ash is specifically a fraxinus, an ash tree. We have green ash, black ash, and white ash in our neighborhoods here. There's also fringe tree, which a lot of the ash feeders will eat. But it is a family level thing, and we're really hoping and hopeful that the way ash is being destroyed by the emerald ash borer, there's going to be a lot of young growth and new ash trees growing up. Even if they don't make it to maturity, small trees can support the caterpillars. So you know, good news and bad news. But anytime we lose a tree, lose a species like this, the cascading effect is significant.
I'm going to just keep going. We've got we're about halfway through our questions, and I think this is so
I'm
fascinating.
glad to have a lot of questions.
It's a great chance for all of us to get more knowledge here. Are there any carnivorous moths? How many species of carnivorous butterflies are there? What is the percentage of carnivorous caterpillars in New England?
Wow. So some of that involves doing some research for facts that I'm not sure if they have been calculated yet. But it's a great question. So first off, most of these species, almost all of them, are only carnivorous or omnivorous in their larval stage. Adult butterflies and moths have sucking mouth parts, so struggle to be carnivorous, although there are some species which are known to pierce and lap up blood and things like that in other countries. But as caterpillars, it turns out that most caterpillars will eat a little bit of meat from time to time. We're working with a researcher in South Carolina to test how many of these caterpillars will eat dead fruit flies. And most of the caterpillars we test stop eating their leaves and go over and eat some dead fruit flies. So eating meat is definitely possible for a lot of these things. But the real sort of drive to do it in the wild seems pretty rare. So we have the harvester butterfly, which I believe is the only fully carnivorous species of butterfly in North America, and that only eats the woolly alder aphids. Then we've got some various relatives of that, blues and hair streaks, which are pretty happy to eat ant babies if they're down in the nest or something like that, but do have a host plant they're associated with. And then there's a long list of caterpillars like the ashen pinion, Lithophony antenata, that I showed you that video of, that could be casually eating an oak leaf, but if an inchworm walks by, they'll just grab it and devour it. But I don't know any particular percentages yet. I'm not sure anybody's ever tried to tally that up.
Here's a question that I wouldn't mind knowing the answer to. What is the safe way to pick up caterpillars to examine them?
Gotcha. The safest way for us and them is to have them on a twig or a leaf, hold them as they're holding on to the substrate they want to be holding on to. So that's a good example is me and this log covered in the Artaceae caterpillars here. So that's pretty easy to do in the wild. You find a caterpillar on a branch and you can snap the tip of the branch and show people and walk around and then bring it back to where you found it and get it settled again. That said, there's a lot of caterpillars, especially the larger ones, that are very easy to handle and that we do hands-on work with for our programs. So the tobacco hornworm is one of them. A big tobacco hornworm you can lift up, move around, kids can hold and pet, and they do very well. We haven't had experiences of them suffering from any kinds of chemicals on people's hands. And frankly, once you see how some people, and especially kids, what they get from being close to a caterpillar and touching it, it's hard to want to just totally limit that. You should know that caterpillars hold on in different ways if you're going to handle them. So you'll feel a bit of stickiness, and that's their prolegs with these little Velcro boots on them.
Wow.
And those Velcro boots, they're basically like grappling hooks that go into a twig or into your hand or whatever they're holding. And if you just pull on a caterpillar, you can tear some of those boots, and you'd want to avoid that. So sometimes rocking a caterpillar side to side a little bit as you're working with it. But for just showing people what you find outside, oftentimes just moving things on the twig they're on is the way to go.
Oh, wow.
They're a little caterpillar anatomy for you at the end.
Are caterpillars in New England found only in the spring and summer? What's the best time of year to search for them?
Great question. Caterpillars are out there every time of year. So there's so many species here. There's high competition, and there's all this predation and parasitism driving these creatures to adapt different little niches in the environment. There's so much of that caterpillars fill every time of year in every way. So this species, this is the undescribed one we found on black spruce. This overwinters as a middle instar caterpillar. So there's a caterpillar out there in the winter, probably on the branches, maybe in the leaf litter. We really don't know with this one, freezing and thawing. The underwing caterpillars, this is a Catocala underwing. There's a lot of these. Can you see the little thorn on that branch? This one overwinters as eggs. So the moth lays eggs in the fall, the egg overwinters, and on the first warm days of spring, the caterpillar hatches out and starts to feed. So really, if people ask, how does a caterpillar get through a year? The answer is every way you can imagine. There's species that overwinter as eggs, caterpillars, pupa, or adults. There's species that overwinter at different instars of being or growth stages as a caterpillar. The tent caterpillars overwinter as fully developed eggs. So they're little caterpillars inside their eggshells waiting to hatch. And on the first warm days, they pop out. So in the middle of winter, you can go out and look on some trees on a warm night, and you might find an inchworm there that's been waiting for that warm night to take its first bite of food.
This next question is from a professional, I assume. If we have a caterpillar we can't identify at an extension office, can we reach out to you? I'm sure.
You can. We're always a little busier than we like to be because I love getting those emails and questions. So please do send them, and hopefully we'll get back to you. If for some reason you don't get a response right away, do feel free to send it again. We're always curious to see what people are looking for and finding. And eventually there's going to be a rather large book of caterpillars coming out of the caterpillar lab. But it still may be a few years yet, but that would help as well.
If we have a caterpillar we can't identify, oh, no, wrong question. What's the number one thing a person new to helping caterpillars should do in their yard?
Well, I mean, helping caterpillars, I think it probably came through a bit. It's really all about the plants. So the first thing you do is you start removing or downplaying invasives and non-native plants. So you don't even need to go out and buy anything, and you don't need to take your favorite non-native plant and chop it down. Just when things are growing up in the corners of your yards, do a little research into what's growing there. And if it's a non-native plant, remove it. And if it's a native plant, whatever it is, just let it grow. Even just letting a little goldenrod, grass, and sedge into your yard can support a lot of caterpillars. So again, if you do nothing else, just discourage invasive non-native plants from your property, and you'll be doing a great job.
If we add leaves to a garden, can it be from any tree? And should it be close by to the live tree in case any caterpillars are in those leaves and need access to the live tree?
So this is an interesting question. I feel like most of the places that I've been, there's just trees losing leaves, and we remove the leaves unnaturally. And usually I can just suggest, hey, just leave the leaves where they are and things will be happy. I haven't worked in an environment that has no leaves naturally falling at all. So I guess the first thing is just leave the leaves, and you might need to sweep some of them away into a flower bed or an understory environment to let some open habitat plants grow at some point. But overall, you don't really need to be carting leaves off at all. I've never thought about introducing leaves. I would do a little research into what type, basically adding leaves is like adding mulch. So I would do a little research into what types of sort of mulch or leaf material most benefits a natural ecosystem. So as it breaks down, is it supporting a number of local detritivores and that kind of thing? Not the best answer, but.
Yeah, right. And the final question here. Let me see. Oh, not the final question. More coming in. What about gypsy moth caterpillars? They seem to be cyclical.
Yep. So those are the spongy moths. So this is the same species. So the gypsy moths were renamed spongy moths recently. Again, it's an invasive species, so non-native, and it eats too much. And the things that we put in the environment to help control it have been detrimental to our native species. So not the favorite thing in the environment here. A lot has already been done to help control these. And you'll notice that when we have bad defoliations from them, oftentimes their numbers go down naturally without any intervention in a year or 2 years. They're still not doing us any favors. I will say it's something that I'm pretty passionate about because I grew up with these caterpillars, and I learned to love them in a way. I'm not pro-invasive species here. We shouldn't have them here. But taking something that's common like a spongy moth in an urban environment, having a big year for them, and bringing it in and raising it with your family is a way to make a lot of good out of a bad, something we don't want to have around. So, you know, I learned to love caterpillars through these. I learned how interesting they were, their cool little irritating spines and how they build a cocoon and pupate. And I never learned that these were good for the environment, and I wouldn't want to teach that. But maybe you can make a resource out of the things that are sort of plaguing our forests at the same time. Share with
Any suggested readings for learning about caterpillars and butterflies in order to help contribute to a suitable environment?
Well, I really like the guide that's out there. David Wagner's a taxonomist researcher down in Connecticut, UConn. He's also a great conservationist and talks a lot about insect decline. His book, I think it's just The Caterpillars of Eastern North America, is a really great natural history guide. It's great for IDs, but each species account talks about host plants and parasitoids and personal experiences. And I think it's a great model for what people should be putting out there when they are building an ID guide, and I'd recommend getting it. So that's a great starting place. There's also a lot of online communities to look at. There's Bug Guide and iNaturalist. iNaturalist is a way that you can contribute your own pictures and add to data. Bug Guide is just a wonderful collection of images online that's larger than any guidebook could possibly be for insects. And then even on Facebook, there are some good resources. We've got a page, the Caterpillar Lab, and there are pages like Caterpillars of let's see, what is it? Caterpillar Identification of Eastern North America or something like that. And those pages have communities of people who like to do nothing more than ID your caterpillars and tell you how great they are. So it's another good starting place.
And this final question, you're going to love. It's preceded by the statement that this was an amazing presentation, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm really captivated by this. It's just amazing. So how can we donate to the lab?
Okay, yeah, the lab is a 501c3. The mission is really built on awareness, just to get people in the know about these creatures and promote them, and through that, hopefully encourage people to protect local ecosystems. You can find us online, thecaterpillarlab.org. You can reach out to us by email, info@thecaterpillarlab.org. You can come visit. So this space is open to the public a few times a week. We call it open hours, where people come in and see all the things we've got and chat with us. You can visit a program. So we'll be all over New England at botanical gardens and sanctuaries doing this work. And yeah, we try to make it as easy as possible to donate, because all of this totally depends on you guys. There really isn't a normal viable way of making a caterpillar lab happen except through generosity and people who care about spreading all of this information and love for the natural world. So thanks for asking.
Thank you so much. We're going to end here. And one thing that I'm very thankful for, not only your work and you and your amazing knowledge, but I'm happy that the Pollinator Pathway can bring you to the world here and have this opportunity to learn from you. So it was the best. I'm going to watch this over again. So,
Well, thanks for the invite.
I'm sure a lot of other people will too. So with that, thank you. And please get in touch with Sam if you have more questions. I'm sure he'll accommodate you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.